Right, there's 2:31. Let's crack on and say hello and welcome everybody on World Rewilding Day. I'm Katia Payne of Journeys with Purpose, and I'm delighted to have you join us today as part of our Wild Horizons series of virtual events to be able to share some of the remarkable work being undertaken by the Lanka Environment Fund in Sri Lanka. Today's webinar is live and the recording will be available to view on our Journeys with Purpose YouTube channel after the event. Leading our fireside chat today is British financier, philanthropist and environmentalist Ben Goldsmith, who had been at the forefront of campaigns for more rewilding in Britain and Europe. He founded and chairs the Conservation Collective, a network of locally focused environmental foundations, which includes the Lanka Environment Fund. Joining Ben is Vinod Malwatte, a Sri Lankan conservationist who has held several positions within the environmental field over the last decade. Alongside other roles, he is director of the Lanka Environment Fund, co-founder of the Parrotfish Collective, a group of conservation communicators, co-chair of the Mangrove Conservation and Sustainable Livelihoods Forum, and a trustee of the Federation of Environmental Organizations of Sri Lanka. Our final guest is Daisy Honeybunn. Daisy is a classical singer, photographer, and TV presenter. Daisy and her husband Praveen Mukhi founded the DHD Foundation in 2020, which supports charitable organizations and philanthropic causes. Sorry, I'm getting a bit tongue-tied today. The foundation's current core projects include working with the Lanka Environment Fund. So thank you so much to all three of you for joining us today on Rewilding Day. And without further ado, over to you, Ben.
Thank you so much, Katia, and thank you to the Journeys with Purpose team for organizing this, and to Vinod and Daisy, who really are my heroes. The idea of the Conservation Collective is quite simple. All of us, all people, have a place that means a lot to them. And while most people don't typically give money or time to environmental work, environment accounts for about 2 or maybe 3% of total philanthropic giving. When you make it possible for people to give their time and their money towards environmental renewal in the place that they really love, they typically say yes. So we've set up so far 20 locally focused environment foundations around the world, everywhere from Devon to Mallorca to the Lamu archipelago of East Africa to Sri Lanka, where we have our Lanka Environment Foundation, and Vinod is our executive director, and Daisy has been a real powerhouse in the board. And the goal of this foundation, like the other 19, is simply to raise money for distribution to the most effective, most exciting grassroots environmental restoration initiatives, for everything from plastics to marine mammals to overfishing to wildlife corridors. And we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of that, because in Sri Lanka, there's just so much going on. The thing I'd love to discuss first with you both, especially with you, Vinod, there's something different about Sri Lanka in respect of how people interact with nature. Now, just compare Sri Lanka with the island of Ireland, which is right next door to where I'm sitting now in Britain. It's the same size. There's 4 times more people than there are in Ireland, 20 million versus about 5 million. There's significantly less GDP per capita. And yet Sri Lanka still has wild forests, it still has several thousand elephants, it still has 1,000 leopards. It's a place of unbelievable natural abundance, while Ireland, just like the United Kingdom next door, has more or less been completely stripped of functional ecosystems and large wildlife. There's really no coexistence going on with wildlife whatsoever anywhere in the British Isles. And I think that points to something cultural or maybe even spiritual in Sri Lanka. You have a plurality of different religious practices and different cultures. But somehow my experience is that people in Sri Lanka are much more willing to live with wildlife and nature and to strive for coexistence. And there's something special in that. And that's, I think, where we should start. How has this little island managed to hold on to so much in spite of all the population and development pressure that has been experienced?
Cool. Thank you so much, Ben, for the question, and to the Journeys with the Purpose team for organizing this webinar, and for everyone who's joined us today. I hope this is an insightful and engaging session, and that you do go away with hopefully a deeper appreciation for Sri Lanka. Ben, just jumping right in with your question, I think it actually dates back to almost the 3rd century BC, actually, because what we looked at at that time, they say that Sri Lanka actually had one of the first designated wildlife sanctuaries in the world that came about actually under the rule of King Devanampietissa, who is at the time runs into one of the monks who's bringing Buddhism to Sri Lanka, and there's an entire story behind that, but in the interest of time, we're not going to get into that. But basically, at that time, that was when I guess the idea of the idea of a sanctuary was brought about, because the monk actually passes down to him saying how he shouldn't be killing a deer. The king was chasing after a deer, and then there's obviously a little bit of an interaction that happens between both of them. And then since then, archaeologists have found it was actually in a stone inscription found in the area where the king actually comes in and says that he commands his people of that area to actually not kill any wildlife or harm any trees. So that dates back to 3rd century BC. So from then to now, we've actually had a lot, and you pointed out as well that the multicultural kind of facet that Sri Lanka brings to the table means that we've got a lot of nature around us, which is fast depleting, I must say, over the last decade, or since the end of the Civil War. But to that point, we have had a society that has been very intertwined with nature, a lot of ancient wisdom passed through the lands. The kings of yesteryear, harnessed the power of the monsoon to really create a land of lakes, which is then overflowed into an abundance of wildlife. Not only do those lakes, help us with the irrigation, and but they also play a role to this day of actually harboring wildlife across the country. So we have been blessed with a bounty of nature in Sri Lanka. And it is a global biodiversity hotspot recognized by Conservation International and all the big groups like that. One of 36 in the world. So we do sit in a very a good place, I would say, on paper. Although I must say, and again, I think the Civil War, just having the Civil War, obviously lots of negative connotations. But due to that, certain parts of the country were inaccessible. And because of that, wildlife and natural resources weren't plundered as much as they could have been during that time as other countries in the world have. But since then, we've seen, as the country slowly has opened up, we've seen increased deforestation, population pressures on the landscape. You did mention the population in Sri Lanka with 22 million people on the island. We're constantly locked in this land man versus, we'll say, land kind of situation, where there is a finite amount of natural resources available, and developmental pressure is eating away at those ecosystems and having we are seeing more increased issues with the wildlife space. So
Vinod, thank you so much. I can tell we're going to have such an interesting discussion, and especially given that we started 2,600 years ago, or whatever it is. And we're going to talk about some of that human-wildlife conflict and the practical difficulties that Sri Lankans have in coexisting with these ecosystems and the wildlife that shape them. Daisy, you love Sri Lanka as much as anyone I've ever met. I think people would be fascinated to hear the origins of your love of Sri Lanka and your ongoing connection today.
The origins of my love of Sri Lanka are, I went there to photograph the Veda, who are the sort of indigenous people of Sri Lanka, nearly 20 years ago. And then with the help of a famous Sri Lankan expat, Charlotte Breeze, who was like a godmother to me, we have ended up in the house that she built. My husband's from India, and so we've got a lot of family on that side of the world, conveniently, because I already love Sri Lanka. And when I suggested that we buy somewhere there and we start basing ourselves out of there, to my delight, he said yes. And it's somewhere I've never met a single person who has been there and not had a huge desire to come back. it is a very special place. It's very hard to pinpoint, but Vinod did a very good sort of intro. We don't want to make too many generalizations, but I think absolutely, you know, I'm a country girl born and raised. Our family works in equestrianism, and I live here. I'm based on a farm in Sussex. And, you know, the love of the natural world extends to wherever you are. And I think, as Vinod was saying, certainly in the south where we are, culturally, as the majority of people are Buddhist, there is this awareness of this peaceful coexistence. And that brings a very unique flavor to things, I think, and somewhere that I very much enjoy being. My husband says that Sri Lankans have a natural flair for drama and are drama queens like me, like an opera diva. I'm not sure if that has anything to do with it, but possibly. But I think, you know, it's an extraordinary place because there isn't the normal sort of institutional support within conservationism you might find in other countries. It means you can get a lot closer to the action. There's a lot to do. But that is something that sort of we enjoy very much. And I think, like Vinod was saying, it's such an interesting mix between what has come about naturally and then some sort of socio-political things like the Civil War. Whilst it had massively negative impact, obviously in myriad ways in Sri Lanka, it has actually been a huge help to the natural world there. And we must see if we can continue to sort of arrest that encroachment and take those, you know, gains and sort of crystallize them.
So I think a lot of these kind of discussions focus on the bad things that are happening, and I'd like us to avoid that on this call. I think it's obvious to people that there is human-wildlife conflict, there are plastic pollution, there's deforestation, there's overfishing, there's all these things, there's wildlife crime, all this stuff that you'll find everywhere in the world. And yet, what I would like us to talk about are, first of all, what remains, because it's astonishing how many special landscapes remain in Sri Lanka. And I think for those that are possibly planning on traveling to Sri Lanka, it would be really great, Vinod, if you could just tell us, you know, where you think the 3 or 4 most special remaining landscapes or seascapes are in the island, and why they're so special. And then I'd like us to talk about the opportunities for expanding those opportunities around corridors, around wildlife recovery. I'm hoping at some point we can talk about the exciting scheme I read about just last week, whereby Sri Lankans want to reintroduce gaur, which is the Indian bison, possibly the only species to have gone extinct from Sri Lanka. But let's just talk quickly about what remains.
So much, Ben. In one sense, I like to. There was a slogan that the Sri Lanka tourism ran about a decade ago. Land like no other, and it truly is a land like no other in so many ways. And it is really a small island and a big trip. There's so much to see. It's one of the only places, I guess, or the only place in the world where in the morning you have the opportunity of, from the coast, of seeing the largest marine mammal in the world, the blue whale, and then driving, you know, across the country, if you will, through the dry zone to the intermediate, through the highlands, and you could drop down into the dry zone yet again, and have the opportunity of seeing the largest terrestrial mammal, the elephant. So and in between, you know, there's a plethora of wildlife that you can witness along the way. Special places, I would say the hill country is one spectacular. It has its own beauty about it, especially some of the montane forests like Houghton Plains National Park, Peak Wilderness, some of the areas that we do work in, beautiful spaces. Then, you know, you come down into Sri Lanka is kind of like an avocado, if you will, like you cut it into 4 quadrants, you know, you can look at it. And the bottom left quadrant is the wettest part of the country and also the most populated, but high levels of endemism in that area. The lowland tropical rainforests have a bounty of animals, from, you know, your frogs to freshwater crabs, to lizards. So we've got it all really when it comes to looking at a lot of those smaller animals. Again, in the north of the country as well, very rustic landscape, very different. But again, and the sheer idea of like driving through the country, I think that's one of the beauties of Sri Lanka, really, the lack of highways, like the lack of big highways. And that's something I noticed when I do go overseas. You know, you drive on the highway and you don't really get a you don't get that sense for the country because you're moving through and you're just on that highway. But in Sri Lanka, just that the lack of highway allows you to kind of really get a sense and understanding of what the country is like as you kind of traverse the landscapes. And on some roads, it is a deterrent because you are moving slowly, but you do get to see a lot as you kind of move through this area. So there is so much to see actually in Sri Lanka.
And these landscapes that you described, from the wetlands up to the higher ground, has connectivity been fully lost? I mean, to what extent are these landscapes still connected? A very famous report here in the UK on how we can rebuild nature summed up the recommendations as follows: bigger, better, and more joined up. And the joined up being a really key point, because none of our landscapes in Britain are joined up. They're all divided by development or linear infrastructure such as highways. Now, do you still have that connectivity of landscapes? And to what extent can the large wildlife move between the landscapes seasonally?
So that, Ben, great question, because it has been changing rapidly, I guess, since the end of the Civil War. We've seen a lot more development kind of spread throughout the country, road networks growing, agricultural expansion as well, which has led to a lot of habitat fragmentation, really, especially in that bottom left quadrant of the country. It's very heavy in that area, populated as well. So it's cut off a lot of areas, which has led to point endemism, which is the idea that endemic species is only available in that point in the world. Sometimes we've got a fish called Asoka barb, who's only in I think a 2-kilometer stretch. Is all it kind of, because of mini hydros have come in, so it can't really move through that landscape anymore. But that's also, unfortunately, one of the issues happening. One of the issues that is hampering the movement of elephants in our country, which is also causing a lot of deaths on both sides actually, but more on the elephant side, obviously. But there isn't a lot of connectivity, we'll say, in as much as we would like. Let me put it that way, Ben. As much as we would like, there are quite a lot of lands are actually shared lands in Sri Lanka between, we'll say, the elephant as well as the human. Lots of animals living in the Central Highland. Things are a little better, I would say. The tea plantations do offer cover, and a lot of the animals that live up there have adapted to that landscape. And our project, the Corridors for Conservation project, which was nominated for the Earthshot Prize in 2024. That project has been looking at the leopard and looking at landscape level solutions and looking at how leopard movement corridors can be connected. And there is connectivity. We're also seeing that the animals do adapt. So there are opportunities for creating increased connectivity, but it has to be done in a very, very, I guess, science-based manner and understanding how we can actually connect these landscapes.
Yeah, I do a podcast series, Rewilding the World, and I interviewed a lady called Jodie Hilty from an organization called Yellowstone to Yukon in the Pacific Northwest of North America. And their whole modus operandi is to connect up landscapes from Yellowstone, 3,000 kilometers all the way up to Yukon. And it's partly about habitat restoration, but it's also partly about creating crossings over linear infrastructure. So these amazing kind of earth bridges so that the caribou can migrate seamlessly across these busy freeways. And it has a huge advantage for humans as well, because it's reduced road traffic accidents and reduced conflict with wildlife around crop damage and so on, if you can create these passages through the landscape for wildlife. And this is one of the projects that the Lanka Environment Foundation really is big on. We want to put together a plan for restoring connectivity across the island of Sri Lanka, whether it's along the mountain ridges or along the valley bottoms. And we've been raising money for this. And Daisy, as kind of the powerhouse of the Lanka Environment Foundation steering committee, I think what will be really interesting to figure out is, how are we going to grow this little foundation? How are we going to get more people, whether they're tourists or people with Sri Lankans in the diaspora or Brits or other foreigners who go to Sri Lanka, or local businesses, to pull together and fund this work, because it's not easy. Raising money for environmental work in a country that has a whole bunch of developmental pressures. They need hospitals, they need schools, but fundamentally, with everything the island has and everything that it does, is dependent utterly upon a healthy ecosystem. So what's our plan for the foundation, I think, is the question.
So I think with anything, it's just education, with a healthy dose of innovation as well. And I think, as you said, during times of humanitarian crisis, which Sri Lanka has absolutely been suffering very recently, the first type of funding to drop off often is towards the environment. And so, Anjali, who leads up the leopard project, of which we will talk, the corridors of conservation more of later, she is a great proponent, and it's something that I've absolutely learned, that there is no environmental project without also a development project at the same time. And I think where we have had particular success in an area that we continue to push forward in is being able to provide slightly longer term funding and provide education to people living alongside, particularly a lot of these communities, and be able to provide that slightly longer term thinking, so that actually, whilst of course feeding your children when that is the most important priority on a day-to-day, but actually that making the wildlife they live alongside not a liability but a benefit to them. And like you were saying, with sometimes a bit of innovation with say land bridges, etc. It's not just about, we do live in the modern world, whilst we'd all like a magic wand, it's not just about returning to things as they were at creation. It's also looking at where we are. And I've been very impressed with a lot of the project leaders who actually are surprisingly more optimistic than you would think at a time that there are some pretty dreary stats to read, and how innovative and how agile they've been able to be. For example, with the corridors for conservation with the leopards, whilst there's a lot of problems with monoculture planting in the Central Highlands and lack of understories, etc., which is why a lot of the beasts are coming down, the project leaders there have said, well, actually, they do still provide good cover. So they've been able to sort of strategically, with the limited resources we have, work with the, make the best of what is there whilst pushing on to long-term change, which I think is really important, rather than, as you say, everyone coming in very despondent and saying there's too much to do, there's too much to change. And again, I think you do manage to get relatively good access in Sri Lanka, and Vinod is very well respected and as an environmental conduit, and we're sort of environmental administrators. And actually, because there's been little government policy, etc., we are in an amazing position to help inform and campaign going forward. So the LEF has absolutely come at the right time, and there is loads of hope. We've had great international support. It is galvanizing further the people who live there and trying to explain to them that without this wonderful biodiversity, without this wildlife, you might not realize how linked that is to your economic prosperity now, but people come here to visit these animals, for example. So we need to ensure that they are still there to help you with your businesses, etc. So it's a multi-pronged approach. And I think also being able to communicate to tourists, your $20 is actually just as important as 20 grand that we might be getting from a big corporate, because collectively we can do an awful lot with that, and so it's this multi-pronged approach, and hence working with Journeys with Purpose, getting people to the island, and maybe Vinod could explain a little bit more about why, because we're one of the biodiversity hotspots, if you do invest into Sri Lanka, actually globally that is helping with conservation. If you can add to that a bit, Vinod.
Yeah,
I think
sure.
Really important about Sri Lanka.
Yeah, I mean, given the fact that we are a biodiversity hotspot, the ecosystem services rendered from Sri Lanka are quite high, especially around the country. We've got our seagrass beds, our mangroves, so there are a lot of there's an opportunity, I would say, to move towards things like nature-based solutions, payment for ecosystem services, even wildlife tourism. There's huge potential. That potential obviously needs to be kind of realized, and that's I think there is private sector as well as government. There is people who understand this. It's about, again, Daisy being really trying to galvanize that and push these somewhat pragmatic conservation interventions forward that sometimes are they are multidimensional and they are long term, right? Ben, you talked about the Yellowstone to Yukon or rewilding Europe. All of these things, they don't happen overnight, right? You're looking at long term periods, and that's something I think we've kind of lacked in Sri Lanka, that continuity. And that is somewhere we can definitely improve as a country, I think, is that continuity and that long-term thinking rather than thinking from like short-term on a short-term basis, right?
Yeah, I agree. So it's fair to say that one of the principal dreams of the Lanka Environment Foundation is to catalyze the protection of existing connectivity in the landscape and the creation or recreation of connectivity that's been lost. So I think that's one of our most important goals. And for a place like Sri Lanka, which still has megafauna, still have ecosystems which are governed by natural processes, that's absolutely vital. Shall we talk about the sea a little bit, Vinod? And I've always found it so fascinating that just the sheer diversity and abundance of whales and dolphins that exists around the island at different times of year. But that's not without its challenges, obviously overfishing, but more importantly, perhaps, is the marine freight traffic. And I know we were working at one stage towards a solution for protecting the whales from ship strikes, which is a huge issue as well in the Western Atlantic. You know, the northern right whale is down to the last few hundred individuals, and it's really fundamentally an issue of ship strikes. But there are solutions to that. So should we talk generally about whales and dolphins?
Yes, of course. I mean, again, Sri Lanka being an island, we do have a territorial sea that is almost 8 times the size of Sri Lanka's landmass, right? And unfortunately, we have very few marine conservation organizations actually working in the space, and that's an area again for expansion where we can have an impact. Because we're not doing nearly as enough as we can as a country, and I really hope that, you know, organizations like, even if organizations like us that act as conservation administrators and act as conduits of funding can be funneling more money and creating green jobs around these ocean spaces, that would be fantastic. With the whales, Dr. Asha DeVos has been doing some fantastic work in the South Coast. On looking at the whales. We've actually established through her research that we found out that the whales in Sri Lanka are actually a pygmy blue whale. They still do grow to you know, almost 70 feet, which is 70 feet. I'm not 100% sure on that fact. I think I'm not sure. But yeah, they are huge in their right. They are still blue whales. But they are resident population in Sri Lanka, and those are the whales that actually are getting affected by the ship strikes. So there was intervention. We were really trying to lobbying and work.
You're right, by the way. That is exactly the size.
Okay. Looking at trying to move those shipping lanes actually further into the ocean, and unfortunately that we haven't been able to fully. But there have been small wins. So some of even though the government hasn't actually sanctioned for the movement, there have been international shipping companies like MSC, one of the biggest ones, who decided to actually move their ships and reduce ship speed as they move through Sri Lankan waters, which is fantastic. So there are little wins that are happening around the country. So it is very positive in one sense. It's just, again, trying to get those resources out there. One of the things we do really struggle with is, I think, the surveillance of our waters, just the sheer size of it. And monitoring is a bit of an issue. So there is opportunities for restructuring, how we as a country spend our money. I would say if we are, Ben, I think if we are as a country to put natural resources first, like Costa Rica has, or Rwanda, countries like that, there is an opportunity to actually, I would say, almost in one sense, demilitarize, because our defense budget, to be honest, is very quite sizable, and it's the 3rd largest per GDP. It's the 3rd largest in South Asia, and we're not even in a war-torn period at the moment. So maybe there is an opportunity for restructuring within the government, demilitarizing and utilizing some of those resources for wildlife guards, more surveillance around those things, anti-poaching, anti-deforestation. It's, again, I think, just reallocation of resources and understanding where our priorities lie and where the bounty in Sri Lanka is, right?
I think as well, just to add to that, is knowledge is power, isn't it? And we have got already a reputation, which is great, of funding some of the slightly unsexy stuff, if you will. For example, we did a survey with Dr. Asher that's undergoing now on population numbers of the whales in various areas in Sri Lanka. And being able, the thing that was so attractive to us to start with when my husband and I first got involved with the LEF and its structure is because we're not yet another organization on the ground. We don't have to be parochial. And so we're not in competition with anyone. And that is super exciting. So we can disseminate the information that we gather, etc., very easily and quite quickly to all of the relevant stakeholders. And as Vinod was saying, I know we moved quite quickly into sort of demilitarization, but it's really interesting, isn't it? And while we're on fire and we need to act quickly, you know, we're already sharing some of the data that we get on the camera traps from something in various areas of the country that we have set up, which, you know, poaching is a problem there. And whilst the army wouldn't be our natural bedfellows, you got to work with what you got, and they are who police it at the moment. And actually it's meaning that that's becoming much more successful, the entire project, by using all the different stakeholders. And you know, it's not about not ruffling too many feathers, but I'm a great believer in you're better to be able to actually get stuff done and have to jump through a few little hoops if you have to make sure that you're being able to operate in the sphere you're in. Vinod is very good with that. But it is really exciting. I think that is and being part of the conservation collective, going back to the whales and the dolphins, you know, the information that we're able to share with best practice, etc., because we've got funds across the world and with people further afield, things do happen quite quickly. And there's certainly, I think, as Vinod said, there's not nearly enough things going on in the marine space in Sri Lanka, which is huge. But, you know, around the world, we know that fishing stocks are going down, etc. And there is already exciting happening things with retraining, for example, sustainable whale watching. We know out of Chile and New Zealand that actually small fishing boats that are no longer able to make a proper career, they have that anecdotal local knowledge of the waters, and they're much more sustainable and they're better for, you know. So there's lots of innovative, exciting sort of movements left and right that we're exploring. And I think now for the LEF, it's quite different year 5 than year 1, because we're able to show people what we have under our belts, and that is in turn gathering funding from within the country, hopefully, as the economy begins to recover. Fingers crossed, making it a bit easier.
We are fans of a band called Depeche Mode. I'm sure there are lots of Depeche Mode fans listening here. And the Conservation Collective is a partner of Depeche Mode for their big Memento Mori tour, which is just coming to its conclusion now. And so we had a big slug of cash from the band and its partner Hublot, which is a watch company, specifically for turning off the spigot when it comes to plastic pollution. And Sri Lanka has really suffered. You know, it's among the worst affected countries in the world by plastic pollution. And what I found amazing was a video that I was sent, one of the projects we're funding, which was about hauling disused and discarded plastic fishing nets from reefs. And so the question I have for you, Vinod, is, firstly, what sort of progress is being made in terms of cleaning up the most harmful plastic pollution on the coast of Sri Lanka? And secondly, how likely is it that Sri Lanka will bring about a full-on ban on plastics, which is, of course, what we need?
Right. Well, in terms of the project, Ben, it's actually going really well. So far, we actually did clean up this morning as well. Pearl Protectors is the organization that we're working with, a fantastic volunteer-based organization with over now about 1,200 youth volunteers who drop in and out of it. And their project, the Cleaner Seabeds, has been doing wonderful work. They've taken out over 1,000 kgs of plastic as well as abandoned fishing gear, as well as nets entangled on sensitive reef habitats around the country. They're working in several locations on the East Coast, as well as in the West Coast and on the Northwestern coast as well. And then one of the projects, Ben, actually that we're working on is in Mannar. It's a transboundary project in the northwestern coast of Sri Lanka, in the Gulf of Mannar Biosphere Reserve, which is a very biodiverse area between India and Sri Lanka. Very shallow as well. There used to be a land bridge that used to connect India and Sri Lanka. So there's a lot of and how the currents in India work is there's a lot of deposition of debris along that area, which does prove to be an issue along that coastline. So we've actually been working there with fishing, looking at fishing, because the fishing industry is very heavy there. We've been looking at a project that over the span of 2 years, we did a very comprehensive research to understand what sort of marine debris was being found in the beaches. And now we are looking at providing again, pragmatic conservation interventions to those marine plastics. We're trying to actually work with fisher folk. So we have about 222,000 fisher folk in Sri Lanka. Fisheries, that's women and men, as well as other coastal communities, I guess, who are reliant on the fishing industry. So we're really trying to work with them to see how we can close the loop on some of these marine litter that we're finding, like nylon 6, which is the predominant thing that you find in nets. So we are trying to establish a material recovery facility network around the country. It is slow going, but that is something we actually just submitted a grant 2 days ago to the British High Commission. And we're hoping to see if we can leverage more funding to establish this material recovery facility network, thereby hopefully trying to close the loop on some of these items and connect people with recyclers and try to see how we can upcycle some of these things. Because unfortunately, some of the waste that ends up in the sea, once pulled out, it's so degraded that you actually can't do anything. But if you are able, when it's discarded, if they actually discard it and maybe the fishers can get some money from that, that can actually be repurposed. And we're seeing it around the world. Bereo is a great example, who've been doing this in Chile. They make skateboards out of a recycled fishing net, and they've been selling at shops like Patagonia around the world. Then you've got multiple other industries that have cropped up around fishing nets. There have been shoes that have been made. So there's just, given the systems in place in Sri Lanka, we already have very progressive apparel companies that work in Sri Lanka who have a lot of this technology. So it's about how can we close the loop by creating these material recovery facilities. And that's something then that we are actively working on with a number of different local organizations.
And what about the chances of a complete ban on plastics by the Sri Lankan government? Because we're seeing good progress here in Europe. This stuff is simply being banned. I mean, they focus on quite niche single-use products. My opinion is that we cannot recycle our way out of the problem. We cannot
ban the lot.
upcycle our way. Yeah. We got to just get rid of plastic, unfortunately, as a material altogether. So that is the question I have for you, Vinod.
I mean, to answer that question, I wish that there would be more progress on the marine side. We've got a national action committee that we formed, and we're working with it to try to see if we can ban certain types of nets being utilized. We did have a catalyst event that happened in 2017, I believe, or 2015, one of the two, where there was a trash dump that collapsed just outside Colombo. 24 people died. And at that point, there was a huge, there was a big kick up about, plastic and all of that. And there was a plastic ban that came about on a certain type of plastic. But since then, it's actually died down quite a bit. And unfortunately, Ben, I think just the cost of plastic, it's become so cheap in countries like Sri Lanka. Like, unfortunately, when we were growing up, at least, you used to see more recycled material. You saw, you get, I guess, like lentils or whatever, peanuts from the guy who used to sell it. They used to give it to you in like a little paper cone. Or paper bags used to be a thing, but unfortunately, it's just become so, plastic has just replaced that. Those industries have gone away, so there is an opportunity, but just the sheer, I think the cost factor has just, plastic is so cheap. I feel like it's very tough in developing country situations like this to see if we can do it. I mean, I'd love for that to become a reality.
You've got an extra participant. Hi. Hello everyone. The next generation of environmentalists. Just to add to that, I think it is a really good point, and it's something we talk about a lot, and what our remit is with limited resources and where we should be focusing our attention, because you do want to do everything. And I think public perception, particularly somewhere like Sri Lanka, which has also a still very rural-based populace, is that one has to be very careful. And I'm sure everyone read in the news what happened a couple of years ago when there was this sort of great edict from on high, organic farming only, banning all pesticides, which I'm sure everyone listening, we all want to endeavour to get there. It's brilliant. But what that has done is so damaging when these policies not implemented properly. Obviously, the yield disappeared because there wasn't proper planning in place, and it happened to coincide with this great humanitarian crisis. So we have decided as an organization right now, while we're still quite small, is, like you said, to try and focus on the positive and give it workable examples rather than spend too much time campaigning right now for this ban, because it feels like sort of public opinion is on such a precipice at the moment because everyone's feeling so put upon, and also they've had this relatively recent disaster. And I think, effective waste management is one of our 4 pillars. It's quite dull, and I'm always laughing with Sally from the Highlands and Islands that when we're putting together our PR stuff, she said you try getting a Scottish farmer holding an oyster on a freezing cold boat, and then she said you've got your leopards charging through the jungle. It's very annoying. She's right though, and it is a balance, but it's really important that we stick also with this. And I think, again, the tourist industry, so now that it is recovering and that hotels are being able to recover and charge proper rates again, we are pushing it back onto them. And as I say, now we're 5 years in, not just a year. We're setting up a levy, and they need to slightly put their money where their mouth is too. And when it begins to affect them, well, economically, which it is, when you see the kind of plastic that is washed into beaches on the tide, that things are changing, but it's beginning to, I think the tourist industry is beginning to wise up a little bit that we have to do something, because otherwise we won't be able to continue to attract people to spend their dollar here. And I think with the marine plastics particularly, there's 2 things in Sri Lanka. There's what's washing in from afar, and there's also what's being consumed in Sri Lanka. And for example, the fisher folk, as you were saying, they take an inordinate amount of plastic bottles out to sea every month for their own water consumption needs. And that's a relatively easy win. So we're trying to look at designs at the moment to see if there's better, sort of storage containers, etc., that they can take out with them. But once they are sort of galvanized in your side and the school kids are understanding it, etc., you're seeing many more beach cleans. Awareness, I think, is the key, isn't it? Awareness.
Thank you, Daisy. Vinod, someone has suggested that you consider the Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund when there's specific projects relating to an individual species. And on that topic, which species can you give us good news about? I mean, we know that things are, let's say, tenuous with elephants because of the conflict and so on. Is there any species that was maybe almost wiped out, which has recovered significantly in Sri Lanka in recent decades? What's a kind of good news wildlife story that you can share with us?
A good news wildlife story. So stump me there, Ben. Let me see.
We could talk about the Indian bison. I understand that the Indian bison, which is an amazing looking creature, which is actually now recovering somewhat from a very low number in India, it was wiped out in Sri Lanka, and I think it was pretty much the only species to be lost altogether from Sri Lanka, because you had to prove your worth as a potential guard to the king by killing a Gaur. And so they were killed off quite early on, maybe 300-400 years ago in Sri Lanka. And now there is a negotiation happening between the Sri Lankan government and the Indian government about bringing them back. Are you aware of that story?
I have heard about it. Yes, in certain areas they are looking at that. I haven't heard too much about it, but it is something that's I've seen floating around. And it would be interesting to see how we would do such a thing, to be honest. Going back to the thing, I would honestly say some of the whale stuff, I would say, is pretty exciting. Like we've been doing pretty well with the whales. That's something that Dr. Asha has been really pushing, and that they've done pretty well. Leopards have also been doing pretty well, I would say. Like, I mean, there are snaring incidents that are happening and things like that, but we are seeing some success stories in certain areas around populations, maybe in the Central Highlands. There is a lot more research coming in around it, which is fantastic. So we're actually getting a lot more. And then obviously some of the smaller cats that sit under that. The fishing cat was a big one, actually. Oh, there we go. That's actually a great example. The fishing cat in Colombo, like, you know, growing up, for example, you only just really heard rumors about these animals being here. And then there's a project that came through. A fishing cat is a small cat, like kind of the size of a Sri Lankan dog, I was going to say, but I'm not sure, like a beagle maybe. Yeah, like a beagle, like a domestic dog. Yeah, so those guys have been found in the wetlands and in Colombo, and basically leveraging the success, leveraging their movement patterns, we've actually been able to conserve what remains of our wetlands in the city, which have actually done a really have done a lot for flood mitigation in the city and things like that. And there's a lot more awareness in the city around fishing cats, and through them, wetlands, which has been fantastic. So the fishing cat, I would say, just that species getting spotlighted has actually done a lot for Sri Lanka. Like Colombo was declared a Ramsar wetland city. It's actually the only capital city in the world that has that designation. Ramsar is a convention that was based in Iran, but it talks about it's a wetland of global recognition, is what a Ramsar, the definition of Ramsar is. So it's fantastic that, you know, we've created connectivity in Colombo around the fishing cat, and we've been able to collar a couple of fishing cats and see how they move, and that has been really successful. And now you have tons of kids programs in Colombo, something that was not there, we'll say 15 years ago when we were going to school in Sri Lanka at the time. And now you get hopefully a younger generation that's going to be more doing more research around little things like even like the otter, which is a species that lives in Sri Lanka but is rarely known by, you know, older generations, because there's just wasn't really that much awareness around these animals. So that is a success story. There we go.
And just to add to that, I don't want people to I think we have to remember, because of the Civil War, Sri Lanka industrialized at a much later rate than many of its neighbors. And there are many success stories. I think there's pluses and minuses to this side. We are more used to, say, looking at conservation in Africa, of highlighting a lot of what these problems were 100 years ago, not 10 years ago. And so it feels like there have been more bigger sort of highline successes. But I think in Sri Lanka, the exciting thing is the turn and the awareness. And actually a quick, very small anecdotal story. We went on our board field trip last May, and I shouldn't say this, but I have to admit, going back to Sally's point about the leopards, you know, they're so beautiful coming through. It's very tempting to just get very excited about the big sort of apex predators. And we were going to visit our invasive species removal project. And whilst I was very excited to go and meet the individuals and the men who were, you know, taking part and actually running the project, I did wonder whether that would be a relatively not hugely exciting morning on our trip. And obviously Vinod is a pro at this stuff, and he knew what he was taking to see us. But to summarize, I remember starting this project 5 years ago in the heights of lockdown on a Zoom call in November afternoon with you guys. And I'm not a horticulturalist, but saying, is this really a 5-year project, or is it more like 10 to 15 years? And we always try and fund in cycles so we're not one-hit wonders. And driving through this landscape was so moving. And particularly as we weren't expecting it, it was quite extraordinary. So year one, where in this landscape that hadn't been touched, it was disastrous. There's nothing. There's no snakes. There's no elephants, no butterflies, nada. You go into the next bit where they had started taking out the invasive species of year one. It's hard work. Year two, it's a lot lighter, the coverage, but they get it before it's seeding. And then when we drove into basically year three, we were literally nearly all in tears, because it's extraordinary, the restoration. And by year four, which we sort of drove into, the animals are back and they'd taken over, the great lawnmowers and the great, and there they were in all of their glory. And it just shows you, if you get out of the way but give them the ability to restore things, it's so exciting. And it wasn't so long ago that Sri Lanka was, you know, we're a lot of us are European dwellers, we're used to all this stuff happening, driving around, and Vinod saying that cloud forest would have covered that whole ridge only 100 years ago. You know, it's quite extraordinary, and we have got time to turn it around. Sri Lanka can be the jewel in the crown. we've just got to get that knowledge out there. But there is hope, and there are huge success stories. And like you say, the LEF being able to join people together and disseminate this, that is exciting. And that is this collaborative approach.
I love that. I mean, the removal of invasive species has been one of the best things we've been involved with as a foundation. I think a difference between what's happening in Sri Lanka and what's happening here in Western Europe is that Sri Lanka still has so much, whereas here, most of what we have is recovering from nothing, from a baseline of very, very little. Mm-hmm. There was headline news was that we'd be doubling the size in England of Wistman's wood, which is a famous relic of the Atlantic rainforest. Britain is a rainforest nation. We have temperate Atlantic rainforest. And when it was decided that Wistman's wood, which is a very famous remaining fragment, would be doubled in size, it was headline news. And then you realize they're doubling it from 8 to 16 acres. So it's tiny. So we don't have very much left. And therefore, the big exciting stories are of restoration. And often that takes place where the land use that is there at the moment doesn't make economic sense. So in Portugal, that might be eucalyptus monocultures for a paper industry which doesn't exist anymore. Or in Britain, it might be sheep ranching, where government subsidies that have propped that up are starting to be phased out, and it's so hopelessly unproductive that no one really wants to do it anymore. The average age of sheep farmers in Britain is about 72 years old. And so a lot of the younger generation are switching to a more nature-centric approach and restoration of nature in conjunction with a much gentler way of farming. Do those opportunities exist in Sri Lanka? Are there tea plantations that are marginal because they're high altitude or they're on steep slopes or whatever? Are there opportunities for large-scale landscape change just by tweaking the incentives?
Yes, Ben. I mean, 100%. Large meaning, I mean, bigger than the 6 to 8 that you talked about, but I mean, not as large as we'll say some of the land chunks that we talk about in Africa, because we've had multiple conversations on REDD+ and things like that for carbon credits, where they're looking at much bigger chunks. But the unique thing about Sri Lanka, especially that highland landscape, as well as going back to that lower quadrant I was talking about, like again, the endemism is so high. So the ecosystem services rendered from those areas could be they're very high. So the value of that land is actually phenomenal. And speaking about the hill country, the central highlands of the country, there is a lot of underutilized tea plantations in the higher reaches that there could be rewilded. Rewilding would be slow in those areas, just given the kind of windswept nature. But again, as Daisy pointed out, if you kind of move out of the way, and you could do assisted regeneration, where you actually grow some of those highland species, or let it kind of take the natural course of action. And animals are thriving within those landscapes in the central highlands, where you have where back in the day, prudent planters decided to kind of leave timber areas for timber reserves that now have become these refuges for wildlife within the hill country. So there is an opportunity to really connect those landscapes, and the work that Anjali's organization, WWCT, is doing is actually understanding how you can foster connectivity and create these bridges, if you will, land bridges, if you will, by connecting these isolated patches of forest, by actually working with the regional plantation companies to identify and then demarcate lands as conservation corridors, and slowly over time, if there's underutilized or degraded lands that aren't being used, then rewilding those zones. So we've got multiple nurseries set up in that area. Sourcing hill country, montane endemic species has been a little bit of a challenge, but there is definitely an opportunity to work with the estate communities to see how we can actually get these saplings, nurture them, and then rewild those zones. So, and again, those areas are the water towers of Sri Lanka. Like, Sri Lanka has been, again, we've been unfortunately in the top 10 countries on the Global Climate Risk Index for the last decade. We're kind of in and out of it, and not a lot of people pay too much attention to these indexes. But you can see the effects of climate change. It was extreme. It was very rainy last year. Now it's suddenly like super hot, and you can see those kind of seasons changing. The area I lived in had the worst floods in 9 years, and we got flooded twice like that in the course of 10 days. So you can see the effects of climate change. And for example, that's why building climatic resilience by improving your ecosystems, improving these watersheds are very important, I'd say. Yeah, so there is a tremendous opportunity for that in Sri Lanka.
Thanks, Vinod. Well, listen, we're into the last 3 or 4 minutes of this, and I'd just like to ask each of Vinod and Daisy to give us their kind of final thoughts. I'd just like to conclude with a plea of the people who've joined this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. We have this little foundation, the Lanka Environment Foundation. It's highly effective, highly strategic. You know, Vinod is very good at what he does. We have a great advisory board helping Vinod. And any money that goes to that little foundation is spent very wisely. It's put in the hands of really brilliant, passionate people who are doing extraordinary things, often on a shoestring budget. So it's like rocket fuel, or I don't know if that's a good analogy. maybe it's like a turbocharge. You know, we're turbocharging the efforts of these people. And so what these little foundations of the Conservation Collective really need is not so much donations, that obviously matters hugely, but they need energy. You know, there's dozens of people on this call who clearly are interested in Sri Lanka. Please just spread the word. Sign up to our newsletters, Lanka Environment Foundation. Ping the newsletters around to people you know. Post on your LinkedIn or your other social media accounts. So just create a buzz around the foundation to help us grow. Because the more money we can raise each year, the more effective we can be in supporting rewilding and other restoration initiatives in what is perhaps the most fascinating and beautiful island in the world. So with that, I'm going to ask Vinod and Daisy to give us their final thoughts, maybe a minute each, and I'm going to thank them from the bottom of my heart for spending this time with us. And once again, Journeys with Purpose, Katya, Eliza, Duncan, thank you so much for partnering with us on this.
I'm going to jump in first because I feel like we're going to want to hear Vinod sum up after mine. Just to say, we have not done a very good job of talking about this amazing trip that is planned for later in the year. And, you know, we were lucky enough as the board to go on and visit all the projects last year. And we talked about it so much, like, how can we recreate this for someone else? And it is in such an under-resourced place. You know, one of my remits is making sure that we don't overburden our project leaders, etc., with, will you meet this donor? Will you meet this potential person? Which is why Journeys with Purpose was so attractive to us. And you have to see it to believe it. And I know I'm a Sri Lankaite, but it's a spectacular place, as Vinod says. It really is quite a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get to go with Vinod and with us and with the board through these landscapes, talk to the people doing the work. And we're very agile, as Ben says, and you don't have access to those people. That's why this is such an extraordinary trip. And, you know, from first-hand experience, just an hour in the car with Vinod driving through these landscapes is better than any encyclopedia or any documentary you can ever watch. And it is so exciting and liberating, and you will feel part of something. And you can also have a blinking lovely holiday at the same time. But I can't encourage you enough to sign up for it. It's going to be spectacular. And as we say, any questions, any involvement that you might like to offer in any way with the fund as a general, keep your eyes posted over the next couple of months. We're going to be starting a huge new PR campaign and trying to show people what we have achieved over the last 5 years. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us, because I know how busy everyone is. But, you know, I hope you go away feeling very hopeful and uplifted, and that there is lots that can be done.
Thank you, Daisy. And Vinod, to conclude.
Yeah, I guess echoing your sentiments, honestly, Sri Lanka, like that's the easiest way to put it actually is that the funds that do come into Sri Lanka go a long way. There isn't a lot of money, unfortunately, that comes in for certain types of initiatives. Very little money. We are a country that's in debt. And because of that, very little government kind of money comes towards the environmental field, and even the private sector has, as much as they try to do, there is still so much to be done. So every little that comes towards conservation efforts in Sri Lanka is well worth it. And through the fund, I'm very proud to say that actually for every $100 that comes our way, 83% actually goes for the projects itself. It's a very small admin budget that we have, and that again is we don't have a physical office. It actually goes towards the employees' salaries, and we're very proud to be facilitating green jobs in Sri Lanka as well, and trying to pay competitive rates, because we really value people trying to do the work and, want people to be paid these competitive rates, because we find that even the environmental sector is something should be treated as equally or even more important than a corporate job in one sense, because
An end to the brain drain.
Right? Brain drain, there's so many things happening in the country. So that is something that we're really looking forward to, hopefully having an impact across the board. So yeah, and obviously come to Sri Lanka. It is a lovely place to visit. It is a small island and a big trip. Whenever you come, there is so much to see. There's 2 monsoons, so whenever you come, you can either go and always escape the rain, escape the heat as well in the hill country. So there is so much to do. So I do appeal to you to do come to Sri Lanka and enjoy our wilderness as well as our beautiful people's hospitality. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and Ben and Daisy for leading us through this, and obviously Katya and the Journeys with the Purpose team for the opportunity to showcase the work that we've been doing. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to round up by saying a huge thank you to all 3 of you. It's just been the most incredible conversation to listen into, and I'm totally inspired. And Sri Lanka is a country very, very close to my heart anyway, so I can't wait to get out there and be there with you, Vinod, as well. If anyone else listening wants to learn more about the journey with Vinod and Ben this November, you can just visit www.journeywithpurpose.org, and all the information is on there, including the itinerary. And just again, a huge thank you to all 3 of you for giving up your time today on World Rewilding Day. I couldn't have asked for a more incredible conversation. So thank you so much. And we will sign off there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You.
Bye.
Bye.